If someone were to say to you that I don't want to go to Disneyland because I did not enjoy the county fair last year, you might point out that Disneyland is in fact very different than the county fair. And by pointing out those differences, you would in turn weaken that argument. Whenever an argument utilizes comparisons, you can weaken that argument by pointing out that the two things being compared are different. And you can likewise strengthen that argument by showing that the two things compared are actually similar. This is especially true when an argument compares the past to the present or the future. So in this case, where the argument says our business model will not succeed, and the reason they gave for it not succeeding is that 100 years ago it failed miserably. One of the underlying assumptions then in that argument is that whatever made that business fail 100 years ago is still around or is still an important factor today. Then, if you wanted to weaken that argument, you would show how the business environment or climate is different today than it was 100 years ago. This idea that things need to be similar when you're making comparisons is especially true when you're comparing groups in some kind of research or study. You need to make sure that when you're comparing groups, the groups are similar in every way except in the aspect that's being evaluated. So in this case, we have a situation where researchers compared two groups of people. People who took a cancer drug versus those who did not take the cancer drug. And what the researchers found is that both groups lived to be roughly the same age. So on the surface, it appears as though the cancer drugs do not help people live longer. Now, notice how the passage doesn't give us any information about the two groups. If you wanted to strengthen this argument, you would point out that the two groups of people, other than the drug-taking aspect, were almost exactly the same. If you wanted to weaken the argument, you would point out how the two groups are in fact different. And here's one way the argument could be seriously flawed. Notice how the argument talks about researchers comparing people who took the drug. And it doesn't say they asked people to take the drug. So it could be that they took people who were already taking the cancer drug and put them in group A, and then they found people who were not taking the drug, and those people were in group B. But if that's the case, you have to ask yourself, why would someone take a cancer drug? And the reason is they have cancer. And the people who aren't taking cancer drugs are likely people who do not have cancer. And so now the study is comparing cancer patients to healthy people. And then, if it's the case that the cancer patients live to be the same age as healthy people, well, then you could conclude the exact opposite, that the latest cancer drugs actually work really, really well because sick people live just as long as healthy people. Another subcategory of faulty comparisons is when you assume the part of something represents the whole. Such as in this case, where the author assumes that carpenters working on hotels before 1930 had more skill, more care, and effort than the ones built after. And the reason he gives is that the hotels built before 1930, they have quality of carpentry that is superior to hotels built afterwards. But the author doesn't say all hotels. He actually limits his samples to hotels that, quote, I have visited. So he's really making two comparison flaws. One, he's assuming that the hotels that he personally visits are representative of all the hotels that still exist and were built before 1930. It could be that he only visits hotels in the nicest part of town. But the more likely flaw is something known as preservation bias. And that is where the sample that survives is only the best of the original sample. For example, if you had two hotels built before 1930 and one was really nice and one was a piece of crap, after about 50 or 60 years, they take the crappy hotel and they tear it down. The only ones that survive are the best hotels. While you don't have to actually remember the name preservation bias, you do need to know that whenever a small sample is taken and then a conclusion is made about a broad situation, the underlying assumption is that the part we're looking at represents the whole.